Hello and welcome. I'm Naghma. Today, in the first episode of the Idea Factory, we're going to talk about Russia, the political situation in Russia, as well as Russia's relation with the outside world, particularly India. It's been a hairy summer for Russia's embattled political opposition. In this August itself, about 50,000 people rallied on the streets of Moscow, where they were calling for fair municipal elections, which is going to happen soon without any prominent opposition, because most of the opposition leaders are already in jail. They've been jailed over previous protests. Now, this protest, which happened in August, was probably one of the biggest protests that Russia saw since 2012. And now the leaders are hoping to build on the momentum of Moscow's, it is being called, the summer of discontent. In a country where protests are very restricted, where it's not allowed to incite any kind of protest amongst the teenagers and it may soon become illegal, Russia has seen many protests this year, especially during the summer, over a wide range of subjects. It has protested garbage, it is protesting to call for fair elections, it has protested to save a park, it has protested the arrest of investigative journalists. So there are varied kind of protests, and in this episode of the Ideas Factory, I have with me Nivedita Kapoor, who is watching Russia and keeps a keen eye on things that are happening in and around Russia to decode the Russian protests, while also looking at the possibilities of an improved and more dynamic Indo-Russian relationship. But Nivedita, I would like to begin with the discontent that we see in Russia. So what does this summer of discontent really mean for Russia? The protest that we are seeing in this country has been a lot on socio-economic issues from what I gathered. I went through your paper that you've written. It hasn't been political in nature. But gradually, the latest one that we saw is turning political. It started with calling for a fair election, but the leaders, the opposition party, whoever is around, is trying to build on this and make it into a political one. What would this mean for the political class in Russia? Do you think the political leadership will be already in jitters because any kind of discontent has been dealt with strongly?
You're indeed correct that the Russian regime has been more willing to allow socio-economic protests to take place. They are put down with much less repression as compared to political protests. Even the month of August, you have narrated how various protests have taken place related to the Moscow City Duma elections. But those protests, a very heavy-handed police presence has been seen. They have put down protests very strongly.
They were arrested common people as well.
2000. Yes, around 2,000 common people have been arrested. About 16 people have been charged with mass unrest, which carries a long prison sentence. So it is very uneasy about these protests. But at the same time, we need to keep in mind that this is a Moscow City Duma election. It is not the main parliamentary election. Also, not just that these protests are confined to Moscow. We have also seen some support in other regions. But the main issue is how would the opposition take these protests forward? Because on September 8th, the elections will take place. And after that, would the opposition still have enough momentum to keep on carrying these protests forward? And what agenda does it have then? And we also need to keep in mind that this opposition, the ones that are protesting, they're the non-systemic opposition. They're not the opposition parties like the Communist Party or the Liberal Democratic Party. They will be contesting elections. They have already registered their candidates. They will be participating in that political protest. But the non-systemic opposition, how will it take these protests forward? That is the major question for them now.
So do you think these protests are happening, are possible now because there is a lot of discontent as far as the economic issues are concerned, as far as the economic prosperity is concerned? Because in your paper you also mentioned there seemed to be a tacit understanding when Putin came to power that you do not interfere in the politics while I deliver on the economic front and Russia becomes prosperous. But that doesn't seem to be happening now, and the whole rhetoric of nationalism also seems to be failing.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and that is the main concern for the Kremlin right now, because the Alexei Kudrin, who is a prominent economist and he heads the audit chamber, last month he warned that there would be mass unrest if the government cannot increase the real incomes of the people. On August 26th, on Monday, President Putin himself met the top economic officials of the country, and he said that the growth levels right now are not acceptable, and the officials need to take measures to increase the real incomes of the people. So the government knows that if it cannot deliver on the economic promises, then it will be in deep trouble.
But there's a figure that 74% protests were focused on socio-economic issue, while only 16.4% on political issues. So if everything is okay on the socio-economic front, Putin can still hope that people will not interfere in the politics, because not many people are willing even now to protest for political reasons, and there is hardly any political opposition. Most of them have been jailed.
Yes, and the main issue is that the willingness of the people to protest. If you look at the polls, the public opinion polls, more people are willing to come out to protest on socio-economic issues. On the political front, the willingness is still a little less. So the people are more concerned about their private lives more, and also the Russians are not willing to have a revolution. They have seen the chaos of the 90s. They want a smooth change to happen. So they are a little wary of any political protests leading to a revolution. So as long as the government takes care of their economic needs, they would still be willing to endure a system that is not the freest.
Some of the political analysts there in Russia have written, to quote one, Dmitry Travin, a prominent Russian political analyst, says that the whole Western narrative was that there is no one but Putin. But the post-Putin Russia is being born today, and if we want to see it, we will. So do you think that kind of political change is simmering in Russia right now?
As of now,
maybe it's
at the national level, it's very difficult to gauge this, because Putin's popularity is still over 60%. So the question of who succeeds Vladimir Putin is still not clear. And not to mention the fact that the opposition leaders like Alexei Navalny, he stood for Moscow mayor's election a couple of years ago. He did not win that election, and his popularity, though quite large, is still not enough for a national mobilization. So who will be the opposition figure who will stand against Putin?
Who will be the opposition figure, and who has emerged as a national leader? There is no one right now. And is it also true that a lot of protests have been organized in a way to shore up the popularity of President Putin, so that he can interfere if it's a socio-economic issue, so he can step in, he can solve the problem, and then he becomes as this big benevolent leader who sorts out people's problems?
Yes, that is a very popular method that the Kremlin uses. So, for example, when the citizens of Yekaterinburg were protesting against a cathedral that was to be erected in a public park, it was President Putin who ultimately said that the opinion of the people should be taken into account. So this was him siding with the regional population, who also formed the bulk of his supporters. At the same time, the president also reshuffles the governors quite regularly. So if there's a governor against whom there are several corruption charges, or who's not very popular, that the president would change that governor to show to the people that yes, I'm listening to you, I see that this person is not doing well, so I am going to replace him with someone who is better. So it's also a way of establishing communication with the people, and also reassuring people that the president is this king-like figure who is listening to the people and is willing to work for their welfare.
With all this political upheaval, in a way, I mean, not at the national level, but there is something is going on in Russia, and the protests have been one of very prominent features that we've seen in Russia in the recent past. Having said that, the changes that are happening, will that also affect the Russian relationship with the outside world, especially with India? India and Russia have had a very long historical defense ties and emotional ties, but there has it hasn't been a very dynamic relationship lately. India has also become more close to the US, or the associations have been different countries, even with France. But right now we did see visits by the Russians, and there has been talk of deepening of economic ties in priority sectors to meet the bilateral trade target of $30 billion. So how do you see all of that? Do you see a more dynamic India-Russia relationship while Russia is dealing with its domestic issues?
The first thing to note is that both the sides have, in 2018, admitted that the relationship, that all is not well with the relationship. They need to shore up the ties. And I say this because the Sochi informal summit happened. The other informal summit was with the Chinese president, and we knew that the relationship with China after Doklam was very dicey, and we really needed to work on that relationship. But if you look at the Indo-Russia relationship, it is supposed to be a special and privileged strategic partnership. So why did we need an informal summit just 4 months before the bilateral annual summit? So this was an indication from both sides that they realized the need, that this relationship is not going where we want it to go, and they wanted to improve the relationship. So after Sochi, both the leaders suggested to the officials that we need more economic ties. As a result, in October 2018, when the annual summit happened, we saw several bilateral documents signed related to the economic field.
Yeah.
And we are hoping that these will slowly translate into concrete projects on the ground, because that has been the problem. Because every joint statement identifies a variety of sectors for economic cooperation, but nothing gets implemented on the ground. But now there's hope that because of clear direction from the top, that is going to change. And another sign of that is the Prime Minister is going to the Eastern Economic Forum, which Russia uses to, which Russia promotes as a forum where it can attract investment from the Asia Pacific. And this is the first time that India will be represented at the highest level. So all of these indicators have given hope that both the sides are focusing on the economic relationship, because that is the weakest link in the bilateral ties right now.
Okay. Because historically we've had defense ties with Russia, but just the defense ties not going to be enough. That's very clear now. You mentioned that Prime Minister Modi is going to be there in the Eastern Economic Forum as the chief guest. Now, why do you think that India-Russia tie has become more crucial, both for India and Russia today? I mean, also when we look at India, and when we look at the changes that are happening in South Asia, do you think that's the reason? I'm talking of Afghanistan, or because of Afghanistan and the Taliban talk, the way America is again becoming soft towards Pakistan because it needs Pakistan still as much as it needed Pakistan earlier. So do you think that's one of the reasons why the India-Russia tie-up is become more important?
You're definitely right about Afghanistan, because India does want its presence in Afghanistan. And unfortunately for it, both Russia and the United States, they've been having their own talks, and both have been talking to the Taliban, and both of them consider Pakistan an important part of the equation as far as Afghanistan is concerned. And it is not most conducive to India's interests. But the only thing that we can hope to do is keep on talking to our partners in Russia and in the United States to make sure that our interests are secure, because our soft presence alone is not going to be enough. We need strong partners in Afghanistan if we are to contain the threat of terrorism, as well as how Pakistan behaves in that country. And also, it's not just about Afghanistan. Indo-Russia relationship is also important when we see the Asia-Pacific region, what we are now calling the Indo-Pacific, because Russia has been growing increasingly closer to China. And given the fact that...
what are the reasons that have been there for this proximity between Russia and China? Because historically there were close ties, emotional ties between India and Russia, but of course India also had to diversify in terms of its defense purchases and all that, which did not go very well with Russia. And China and Russia came together on many issues.
Yes, so the Russia-China relationship has been improving since the early 90s. But they've come remarkably closer since 2014, when Russia's ties with the West broke down. It immediately turned towards China, because Russia realized that it needed a strong partner in this world, and China was that partner. Whether they both have political convergences in terms of resistance to US hegemony, in terms of a multipolar world. The economic ties have grown very, very close. The energy ties, because Russia primarily supplies arms and energy to the world, and China, it supplies a huge amount of energy to China, both oil and gas. And we also have to understand that India at this point, it has its own economic considerations, it has its own foreign policy goals. So we cannot provide those kind of public goods to Russia that China can at this moment. So that has contributed to Russia moving towards China after 2014. And that relationship has grown closer. Now we are seeing joint air patrols. We saw that in July, and that was the first time over East China Sea. So it's a sign of growing convergence on political front, on military front, on economic front, and that might not be most conducive to India. So we need to keep our channel with Russia open to make sure that Russia also has an option. It knows that it can have a very good relationship with India. So that does not go completely over to China.
Yeah, yes. So you're saying India would benefit from closer cooperation with Russia and Indo-Pacific, especially.
Yes.
And when we look at, I too spoke of Afghanistan, then of course Kashmir comes in.
Yes.
And when we look of Kashmir right now, Russia is a permanent member of the UNSC, and it has supported India on various issues, which includes Kashmir.
Yes.
While America plays a right now, especially America has been a little more intrusive as far as Kashmir is concerned, and the offers of mediation or Trump's statements, all these issues are also there right now. And it has moved closer to Pakistan. In that context as well, it's important for India to get closer to Russia, or to form a strategic alliance with Russia while maintaining its relationship with America or with other European nations.
Yes, that's definitely correct. When we looked at the UNSC meeting on Kashmir, just before that, on 14th of August, the Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, had a conversation with the Pakistani Foreign Minister, and he made it very clear that this is a bilateral issue and there is no other way for you to resolve this issue other than through bilateral consultations, which is in line with Indian policy. So despite the fact that Russia has tried to improve its relationship with Pakistan, it has also tried to make sure that it balances the relationship with India. And even though New Delhi has not been very happy at Russia selling some helicopters to Pakistan, building a gas pipeline, but we also need to understand that Russia cannot compromise on its national interests. So both the parties have to do the same thing. We have to look at our national goals.
But are the national goals now getting, sorry interrupting you, but on the national goals, are they getting more and more divergent?
That is the main concern, that because of the foreign policy issues, our bilateral relationship might be very good, but the way we are looking at our position in the world, the way India is looking towards the United States with an eye on how it will position itself in the world, and how Russia looks at China in order to position itself in the world, they are going in very different directions. And that is an external constraint on the bilateral relationship that is going to be very difficult to address, because it is not just bilaterally that we can address this. There are international factors that might not always be in our control.
Yeah, so that's one of the main problems, and also because India and the US were termed as natural allies, and it was termed as a defining partnership of the 21st century. But when the moment the Doha talks started, we saw that those assumptions were actually not true. So looking at all that, again, the fear that US is not going to just be there, you have to look after your own interests, and that, I think, is a big concern for India right now. When Prime Minister Modi visits Russia and he's going to have a conversation with Mr. Putin, these concerns would also be big.
Yes, definitely.
Other than just the bilateral or the economic ties.
Yes. Also because these issues have become all the more important because of CAATSA, issues like CAATSA, because these are US unilateral sanctions that are now affecting the Indo-Russia defense relationship. We have said that we'll purchase S-400, but the threat of the US sanctions and how India and Russia are going to deal with it. So it's a concern. Otherwise, our bilateral defense ties should ideally not be impacted by an external power. But this is happening, and we need to be able to deal with these issues, and it remains on the leadership as to how they will deal with these issues.
And when Putin has proposed a very extensive Eurasian partnership, it should be used by India to strengthen its position. Do you think there are possibilities that India can use this forum for the Eurasian partnership to strengthen its position there?
Yes, so there's a number of steps that the government is considering in order to strengthen the Eurasian partnership. Is a free trade agreement that we have started negotiating between the Eurasian Economic Union and India. So that is another way that we are cooperating through our engagements in the SCO. That's another way where we are looking at the Eurasian region. We are also trying to fast track the INSTC. I don't know if it's actually going to happen, but these are some steps that both the governments are taking to make sure that they, especially in Eurasia, that they can come together and strengthen both the economic relationship as well as counter the presence of other powers in the region.
So, Nivedita, to conclude this, can we say that Russia is also going through a very a volatile phase right now, politically,
Yes.
if not nationally, but there are simmerings, and at the same time, we can look at a more dynamic Indo-Russia relationship in the coming years?
That would definitely be the hope for the dynamic Indo-Russia economic, especially the economic relationship. And we are hoping that the 2019 summit would be a precursor to furthering of the bilateral ties. And as far as the political upheaval in Russia is concerned, I think time will tell where it goes.
Or at least those little shocks have started.
They definitely have.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for decoding these Russian protests for us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.